I'd like to thank Sheila for so kindly inviting me to give the first of these talks in place of Timothy Duke, who, as she explained, very sadly can't be here. I should say that I'm indebted to him for invaluable help, especially in facilitating my looking at the funeral report of Lord Marney in the College of Arms. So I can't possibly hope to match the expertise that he, as Clarenceux, King of Arms, would have brought to bear on his intended subject of heralds and funerals. I, of course, will be saying something about that subject. It would be impossible to avoid and do justice to the overall subject. But I'm going to focus on Lord Marney's funeral, and what I'm hoping is that my talk will form a sort of bridge between the reenactment that you staged in July, which of course I had nothing to do with, and these celebrations, this part of the celebration. So I'll begin with some general remarks about the purposes of early Tudor aristocratic funerals before homing in on Lord Marney's own funeral. And as we then follow the course of events during several days of elaborate ceremonies, I'll include some comparisons with the funerals of other peers. So, in general, prayer for the soul of the dead person, especially in the form of masses, concentrated around the burial day and at intervals thereafter, was especially important. All participants in funerals rendered the deceased some form of dutiful service, so hence the term obsequies applied to these ceremonies. Their somber mourning garments betokened an acknowledgement of loss and reminded spectators of the ubiquity of death. An important part of the duty to the dead was an appropriate affirmation of his or her status according to their rank or degree, as the contemporaries would have said. It fell to the heir and executors of the deceased not only to celebrate the funeral in a fitting manner, but also to welcome those who took the trouble to attend and participate. And funerals often included not just lavish feasts, but also substantial alms bestowed on the poor, whose prayers were regarded as particularly efficacious. Now, perhaps the most eloquent and revealing portrayal of what a Tudor funeral looked like is the famous memorial picture of Sir Henry Unton. He died in France in 1596 as Elizabeth I's ambassador there. You may think, well, what on earth is he doing? Showing us a picture from 70 years later. Well, it's more vivid and more comprehensive than any picture that we've got from the time that we're actually talking about, actually focusing about. It presents every major stage and aspect of Sir Henry's life, but half of it, the half that I've got here, is devoted to his death and its aftermath. Death was conventionally viewed as the climax of earthly existence and the threshold of everlasting life. Despite the religious revolution that had taken place between the 1520s and the 1590s, some of the most fundamental elements of the customs and rituals surrounding death really underwent relatively little change. In the Unton picture, we see Sir Henry's deathbed. We see the return of his corpse from France in a cortege trapped in black. And in the foreground is the long funeral procession. The participants nearly all enveloped in long cloaks and capacious hoods, except, notice, for the bearers, presumably because they really needed to see where they were going. They needed all-round vision, or the closest to it. Amid the sea of black, you see the brilliant colours of the herald's tabards, the escutcheons of arms on the sides of the coffin, Sir Henry's standard, and a banner. The ceremonies culminated in the church, crammed with a black-clad audience, listening attentively, we hope, to the preacher. And on the left is the magnificent monument that Henry's widow commissioned for him. Who planned and organised 16th century funerals? In their wills, people often left instructions concerning important aspects of these rites. As we shall see, this was certainly true of Lord Marney. The principal concern expressed in his will was for the health of his soul. The executors will nevertheless have had to decide on the scale of the funeral, the provision of hospitality, and the selection of invited participants, though unfortunately we know all too little about these aspects. The responsibility for ensuring that funeral ceremonies were conducted in a manner appropriate to the rank or degree of the deceased belonged to the officers of arms. Representatives of royal authority, their presence reminded those taking part in the funeral of royal approval and the monarch's role as the fountain of honour. Their work included such crucial aspects as the display of the proper arms. It's impossible to underline that too heavily. Marshalling the funeral procession and the correct observance of precedence. Everybody had to be in their right place. Organisers of such funerals drew on the services of a host of craftsmen, including painters, carpenters, drapers, wax chandlers. These events usually demanded weeks of preparation. Our two principal sources for Lord Marney's funeral are his will and the account in the College of Arms. The two sources are complementary. As a narrative, of course, the Herald's report is much the fuller. The Crown enhanced the role of its officers of arms as a means of gaining control over the granting and use of coats of arms, essential marks of social rank. One of their duties was to prevent the unauthorized display of arms at funerals. The recording of heraldic funerals grew more frequent under the Tudors. Lengthy, descriptive reports of some funerals survive in several versions, and Lord Marney's funeral is one of those which has 3 or 4 accounts at least surviving in the College of Arms, varying in details. So we can't actually say exactly how common heraldic funerals are at this time. Timothy Duke hazarded the guess that they probably gradually spread out over the country and were more tightly controlled with the passage of the 16th century. But circumstances sometimes ruled out these elaborate obsequies. Richard Grey, Earl of Kent, for example, died at the sign of the George in Lombard Street in April 1523. So, almost the same time as Marney. The terse record in the College of Arms doesn't mention the attendance of any officers. It simply says that he was buried in the White Friars in Fleet Street. Now, Richard was an inveterate gambler and wastrel. His son Henry actually refused to assume the title because he felt he couldn't support it because of poverty, by reason of his slender estate. I mean, obviously, all these things are relative, but disease might also result in a swift burial that allowed no time for elaborate preparations. In 1517, for example, the young Lord Clinton died of the sweating sickness, and he was buried the same day. Some Tudor wills include strongly expressed wishes that their makers should be buried without unnecessary pomp, sometimes with the proviso that their rank and degree should nevertheless be duly recognized. So, funerals offered an opportunity of underlining the importance of an individual or family, especially after a period of eclipse or in face of some challenge. The 4th Earl of Northumberland, for example, had been killed by hostile protesters in 1489. His colossally expensive funeral emphasized his family's continuing importance in the East Riding. William Courtenay, Earl of Devon, had been imprisoned under Henry VII. Henry VIII restored him to favour early in his reign. At his funeral in 1511, the preacher exonerated him of all infidelity against his sovereign lord, saying that he had been falsely accused. After fighting for Richard III at Bosworth in 1485, Thomas Howard was released and given important responsibilities comparatively quickly, but he was promoted to his father's highest honour of Duke of Norfolk only after his famous victory over the Scots at Flodden in 1513. His 1524 Thetford funeral was particularly grand, costing the then colossal sum of £1,340. And according to the Institute of Historical Research Currency Converter, that amounts to a sum well in excess of 500,000 in today's values. The background to Marney's funeral was clearly very different. He died shortly after his appointment as Lord Privy Seal and his subsequent ennoblement. His obsequies underlined how far he'd risen during a long career of loyal and varied service, but they certainly didn't come close to matching the grandest funerals of peers well above him. Of course, he was a newly minted peer, well above him on the peerage scale. Didn't come close to matching those grandest funerals in scale or expense. His will is dated on the 22nd of May, 1523, i.e. only 2 days before his death. Its length and its detailed provisions suggest, however, that he'd been thinking about it for some time and that a draft had already been prepared. He began with a conventional bequest of his soul to Almighty God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and all the holy company of heaven. My body, he continued, to be buried in the chancel of Layer Marney Church, if I depart at London or at any place near London where divers of my ancestors lie. I will that if I happen to die now, that then mine executors do for my burying according to my degree, and that my hearse be provided for here in London with masses and diriges and all other services as should be at my burying. I read that out partly because it strikes me it's rather loosely drafted. Here's a doubtless very sick man, very shortly before death, but because he actually refers to, if I happen to die now. And anyway, it seems to me that it left some room for interpretation. His body was to be conveyed out of London, accompanied by the 4 orders of friars there, each order to have 20 shillings. Each church meeting his body on the way with the cross was to receive 3 shillings and 4pence, and every church where his body rested on the way overnight, 6 shillings and 8pence. 24 poor men were to hold torches at his burial and mass, each of whom was to receive for his labour a black gown with a hood and a shilling. He wanted 30 priests at his burial, if they were available. They were each to receive 8p if they participated in the customary services, both on the eve of burial and on the day itself. All clerks in minor orders were to have 4p, all children 2p. These numbers are actually, they may seem large to us, but they're very small compared with the funerals that I mentioned of the Earl of Northumberland and the Duke of Norfolk. So all doctors or bachelors of divinity who sang high mass were to have 10 shillings. So a great deal more than the ordinary clergy. He also wished that some doctor or cunning man make a sermon the day of his burial, he to have 20 shillings for his labour. On his burial day, 20 pounds in alms were to be dealt to poor people, and in penny and 2p doles where his executors thought needful. The comparable sum at the Duke of Norfolk's funeral was £100. Marney concluded the provisions for his funeral by stipulating once again that there should be a convenient hearse about me in the church, according to my degree, as by mine executors shall be thought convenient. Apart from the main sequence of funeral services, Marney willed that trentals, i.e. sets of 30 masses, should be said immediately after his death for his soul, as well as the souls of his direct ancestors as far back as his great-grandparents, for his 2 wives, his deceased children, and all other Christian souls. These trentals were to be said at the Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, and also by the observant friars of Greenwich and Richmond, the 4 orders of friars in London, the Black Friars in Chelmsford, the Holy Cross and Grey Friars in Colchester, and the Carmelite Friars in Malden. Each order to have 10 shillings for their labour. The time normally needed to prepare a nobleman's funeral and the length of the proceedings themselves made it imperative to prepare the body. The day after his death, Lord Marney's corpse was seared, i.e. smeared or saturated in wax, or wrapped in a waxed winding sheet, and probably anointed with spices and sealed in lead. His corpse was then placed in a coffin. Given their scale, the ensuing ceremony seemed to have been organised remarkably quickly. Only a week elapsed between Marney's death and the removal of his body from his house at the start of the public funeral ceremonies, compared with 6 weeks in the case of the local Earl of Oxford in Essex in 1513, and over 4 weeks in that of the second Duke of Norfolk in 1524. Meanwhile, Marney's London residence was hung with black cloth, garnished with escutcheons, i.e. shields of his arms. The use of huge quantities of black cloth to cover buildings and the interiors of churches, and, of course, for the mourning garments, was one of the distinctive elements of the gentry and nobility, and probably generally the biggest single element in the bill. The brightly coloured escutcheons, standing out against the black background, made a gorgeous display, and you can get some of this, some feeling for this in the Unton picture, I hope. Masses for Marney took place every day, and friars of different orders kept watch continually in his house. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 31st of May, Marney was escorted in procession the short distance to his London parish church of St. Swithin's, London Stone. It must have been a really short distance because it's a tiny parish. So even if they went a roundabout route, it strikes me that it's a fairly short procession. A cross preceded the procession. Then came the clergy of St. Swithin's, followed by gentlemen walking 2 abreast. Then Marney's chaplains, John Ventnor, Abbot of St. Osyth, is that the right way to pronounce it? Priory in Essex, the executor of Marney's will, along with John, the second Lord Marney, preceded the most spectacular element of the procession. And to give you some idea of what this might have looked like, another picture, I'm sorry, from much later. So Sir Philip Sidney's funeral, that's the standard. Okay, the standard. That great sort of elongated triangle with the sort of bifurcated, the forked end. First came the standard, then Rouge Croix Pursuivant, wearing Marney's coat of arms, accompanied by the banner of his arms, borne by Marney's kinsman, Anthony Darcy. After him came Marney's helmet and crest, borne, because he had been Lord Privy Seal, by Richmond Herald, wearing the King's coat of arms. Clarenceux and Garter Kings of Arms. So there's Tim Duke's predecessor. Clarenceux and Garter Kings of Arms also wore the King's coat. The presence of two Kings of Arms, the senior officers of arms, together with a herald and a pursuivant, underlined the fact that this was the funeral of a man who'd been a great officer of state, as well as a baron. Marney's body was conveyed by 6 gentlemen. On each side at the front were banners displaying the arms of one of Marney's 2 marriages, borne by a sergeant-at-arms, and one of Marney's sons-in-law. Behind them came 2 banners of saints, one of the Trinity and St. Henry of Bavaria, his name saint, the other of Our Lady and St. George. And here we can look at this. That's looks something like that. You can see the hood. You can see closer up the hooded mourners and the bearers without hoods. I pointed out in the Unton picture. So the mourners followed. There were 7 of them, the number appropriate for a baron. Marney's son, Lord John, the chief mourner, led. Behind him were 6 members of distinguished Essex or East Anglian families. Sir William Wardegrave, the young heir's father-in-law, and Sir Roger Wentworth, then Sir Thomas Tyrrell and Sir Thomas Tay, and finally 2 more of Marney's sons-in-law. A yeoman brought up the rear of the procession. William Standish, Bishop of St. Asaph, resplendent in episcopal vestments and insignia for celebrating Mass, or pontificals, as they were called, censed the corpse at the church door, i.e. wafted incense over it. In the body of the church were 4 gilt candlesticks containing branched tapers with escutcheons and pencils, little triangular heraldic pennons. The church was railed, i.e. furnished presumably with rails round the corpse, hung with black cloth and decorated with escutcheons. The service celebrated late that day would have been the office for the dead. The dirge, or dirige, from the opening words in Latin of Psalm 5, verse 8, "Lead me, O Lord," together with the Vespers of the dead, the placebo, "I will please thee, O Lord, in the land of the living." At the accustomed times, Rouge Croix Pursuivant announced a paternoster for the souls of Marney and all other shriven persons. Afterwards, the mourners returned to Marney's house. Gentlemen, friars and clergy of St. Swithin's kept an honourable watch in the church throughout the night. The following morning, Monday the 1st of June, all the mourners came back to the church for the most important funeral service, the Mass of Requiem, from its opening words, "Give them eternal rest, O Lord." Of course, in that. At the offertory, John Marney offered a half noble, 3 shillings and 4pence, and the other mourners 4pence each. After an early dinner, that's, of course, in those days always a midday meal, the body went on its way through and out of London. Oh, sorry. Yes, I should have pointed these out. These are the 4 banners carried around the corpse. and here is the route on a modern map. I hope that's reasonably clear. The red line shows the approximate route. So Granite House is the site of St. Swithin's London Stone as closely as I can determine, but you will have traversed this route presumably in July. I mean, I don't know about anything about that. So then I'll just show you how it would look on a Tudor map. That's okay. So despite the fire, the street plan isn't all that dissimilar. 6 horses trapped in black with scutcheons of arms drew a char or chariot covered with black velvet with a white satin cross on it. The chariot carried both the corpse and the representation or effigy of Marney's body, which could be seen through the side of the chariot. One function of the lifelike image of the newly dead man, so we're told, was to inspire spectators' prayers, give a more vivid sense of the presence of the dead. Over the corpse was a black cloth with a white cross under a pall of cloth of gold. On top were helmet and crest, target, i.e. shield, sword, and the coat of his arms. Collectively, the achievements or hatchments. One shouldn't think of these as being all that precious. I mean, they were made specially by craftsmen for the occasion. They were, they wouldn't have served in real life, in a battle. I think it's fair to say in nearly every case, they're really remarkably inexpensive when you look at the bill for the creation of the hatchments. The corpse was accompanied by 4 bannerolls of Marney's descent and marriages. Notice his motto, Loyaument servir. First in the procession came members of the 4 orders of friars and members of the hospital of poor priests called the Papi. About the chariot were the 24 poor men in black gowns and hoods with 24 great torches. This was actually quite a modest number compared with some other funerals. And later on, it was very often customary for dignitaries to be preceded by as many poor men as the years they had lived. Certainly not the case here. 12 yeomen on horseback bore 12 great stave torches. The procession went north along Houllbrooke, presumably after going a short distance west along Candlewick Street. In order to reach Cornhill and then Aldgate. Leaving the city, it reached the green beyond Whitechapel Church. Here the torches were put out. The long torches and the poor men's black gowns were put into a cart to be conveyed to Leia Marney. The friars, priests, and the clerks returned home. The priest of every parish on the route through London and the countryside beyond sensed his corpse, and in accordance with Marney's will, they each received 3 shillings and 4pence reward, as well as the 4 escutcheons of arms. The length and duration of Marney's funeral journey were both considerable. I reckon that from his burial place in Leia Marney Church to St. Swithin's is about 48 miles. The journey took 3 days. So this is the one pretty long and exceptional element. The funeral cortege of the Earl of Northumberland in 1489, Prince Arthur in 1502, and the Duke of Norfolk in 1524 all took 2 days, and the Earl of Oxford in 1513 just 1. the longer of these Duke of Norfolk's, for example, and Prince Arthur's, a little over 31 miles. So it was quite a long way to go, and quite the payments to the churches on the way would have been, I think, quite a large element on the bill. The first night of the journey, Monday the 1st of June, was spent at Brentwood. There the corpse remained in a little chapel lit by 2 branches holding 7 candles, held by 2 poor men. Dirige and Requiem were sung. After the Dirige, the principal mourners lodged at the sign of the Crown and the officers of arms at the sign of the Heart. I don't know whether those inns still exist. Once the lords and gentlemen had dined, after the Mass of Requiem the following morning, every man took his horse, and the cavalcade proceeded to Chelmsford. There, the priests and clerks of the parish church, together with the Black Friars of Chelmsford and the White Friars of Malden, met the corpse at the town's end. You may remember that Marney had requested the prayers of both these houses of friars in his will. The procession went through the town, through Chelmsford, to the Black Friars' house, where the corpse remained overnight, as it had at Brentwood, and Mass was sung by the prior the following morning. The chief mourners lodged at the sign of the Lion, the officers of arms at the sign of the Bell. I just mention these in case anybody with local knowledge is interested. After breakfast on Wednesday, the procession set out once more until it came within half a mile of Lea Marney. There, a certain number of priests met the corpse, as did the abbot of St. Osyth's, attired in his pontifical vestments, a quarter of a mile further on. They then advanced in procession to the parish church of Lea Marney. All the participants dismounted in the churchyard, and the corpse was borne into the church by the same 6 gentlemen who'd carried it in London. There it was placed in a closed hearse. You've come across this word hearse in my account of the will. I should explain what that is. It denotes at that time not a vehicle as it does today, but a structure designed to receive a body during the funerary rites, regulated in accordance with the rank of the deceased. There were rules governing its size, elaboration, and adornment. And before the Reformation, the most striking feature of the hearse was the array of candles it supported. The structure resembled, in some respects, a sort of giant four-poster bed. Let's look at a good, nearly contemporary picture. Oh, yes, just to take that in. Sorry, I should have shown you that, just that bit earlier, making my point about the roots of the 3 funeral processions that I mentioned. Okay, right. So we get to Lea Marney Church and we go inside. I don't think there was room for the structure quite as grand as the one I'm going to show you, but there we are. That gives some idea of what it looked like. So the design of Islip's hearse enables us to understand the description of Marney's as having 5 principals, with the mortars and branches according to the same. 5 principals, including one in the middle of the structure, are clearly visible in this picture. Mortars were giant candles, and branches refers, as we've seen, to branched candle holders. The hearse also had a valance decorated with his crest and arms of his descents, set with little pennons and scutcheons, with his motto, Loyalement Servir. We can easily see the valance round Islip's hearse and just make out the word Islip on it. Banneroles of descent and pennons of arms stood at the 4 corners of Marney's hearse. The depictions of Islip's hearse show very clearly the black cloth set with a white cross over the corpse, and the position of the hearse in the body of the church with the choir on the right. Marney's hatchments were placed over his corpse within the hearse. The abbot of St. Joseph's began the dirge. Once all the appropriate ceremonies and prayers had been completed, the mourners went to the said place, that's this house. Then the corpse was buried as appertaineth, which done, every man went to the foresaid place that night. This passage is a bit puzzling when compared with other funeral certificates and reports, which clearly place the burial at the very end of the sequence of funeral services. In the cases of Prince Arthur's and the Duke of Norfolk's funerals, this was reportedly a moment of great emotion when their household officers broke their staffs of office and threw the pieces into the grave, a ritual marking their last farewell to their late master. Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning of Thursday the 4th of June, the prior of St. Botolph's Priory in Colchester began the Mass of Our Lady. Sir William Waldegrave, second of the mourners to be named, offered a gold half-noble. All 6 mourners present then went to fetch Lord Marney. Of course, the new Lord Marney. Once he had arrived and been placed, the Mass of the Trinity began, sung by the Abbot of Coggeshall. The sermon, customarily delivered towards the end of greater funerals, was given on this occasion by Dr. John Watson, Master of Christ's College, Cambridge. The famous humanist Erasmus considered Watson a distinguished theologian and consulted him about his edition of the Greek New Testament. Erasmus described Watson as, in the balanced eulogistic assessment typical of the era, devout without bigotry, sociable without triviality, and strict but not severe. I leave you to work out the difference. He had been instituted rector of St. Mary Woolnoth. He'd been appointed rector of St. Mary Woolnoth, one of the London parishes immediately adjoining Marney's parish of St. Swithin, as recently as April 1523. So doubtless he'd come to the notice of the executors. His text on this occasion was Beati mortui qui in Domino moriuntur. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth, from Revelation chapter 14, verse 13. Praise of the late Lord Marney is highly likely to have been an important element of the sermon, as was certainly true of the sermon delivered at the Earl of Oxford's funeral 10 years before. The sermon for the Duke of Norfolk in 1524 on the text, Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered, Revelation chapter 5, verse 5, lasted nearly an hour. Finally came the Mass of Requiem, celebrated by the Abbot of St. Joseph, with the Abbot of Coggeshall as deacon and the Prior of St. Botolph's in Colchester as subdeacon. At the offering, the chief mourner, Lord Marney, followed by the other mourners, offered a reel of gold, originally worth 10 shillings. All 6 mourners, besides Lord Marney, took part in offering the hatchments of the deceased, his coat of arms, target, sword, helmet, and crest. They and everybody else then made their own voluntary offerings. After Mass had ended, Anthony Darcy offered the banner of Marney's arms that he had borne in London. The offering of the arms and banner was a ceremony of great symbolic and emotional charge. The insignia of the deceased's status and earthly function were entrusted to the Church's custody. Now, the funeral ceremonies of the greater nobility, from the rank of Earl upwards, included a most dramatic ceremony, which didn't actually, of course, take place in the funeral of a mere baron, when a courser, a a horse, a charger or stallion, draped in black, ridden by a knight with an axe held downwards, entered the church, which was offered as well as the hatchments. And this ceremony was achieved great effect in the reenactment of Prince Arthur's funeral in Worcester Cathedral in 2002. Afterwards, the Abbot of St. Osyth's censed the corpse and grave, saying the De Profundis, the penitential Psalm 130, "Out of the depths I have cried unto thee, O Lord." That ended. The lords and the other mourners went to dinner, and thus finished the noble interment of the Lord Marney. This was not quite the end of the herald's narrative. After the dinner, the officers of arms took their leaves of the said Lord Marney, who gave them in reward £10 in gold, besides all the other costs and charges he had borne. Each herald had borne. All four had livery of cloth for their gowns, horses, riding gowns, and servants, according to their rank. Now, perhaps I can add as a sort of extended postscript that in accordance with customary practice, Marney envisaged that the work of intercession for his soul would continue long after his death. Mass and dirigy would be celebrated at his month's mind, that's a month after he died. He willed that all priests and clerks that had participated in these services would receive the same wages as at his burial. For the longer term, he willed that a new almshouse should be built of brick for 5 poor men unable to get their living. These poor men, generously provided for, were to be able to say their Paternoster and Creed in Latin. It seems quite a big ask. I don't know quite how many. It's interesting that poor men able to say their Paternoster and Creed in Latin. They were to be bound by a carefully prescribed and detailed round of daily prayer and mass attendance in the almshouse and in the nearby church for the souls of Marney, his ancestors, and members of his immediate family. 2 good and honest priests who understood what they read, an important qualification, were to say a daily mass and weekly placebo, dirigy, and commendations for his soul and the other souls specified. The priests were to have a chamber in the almshouse so that they might supervise the inmates. Marney intended these provisions to continue forever. The enormously elaborate round of prayers he envisaged would, however, I'm afraid, have fallen victim to the Chantries Act, passed in 1547, if it had lasted that long. In 1572, the almshouse itself was granted by letters patent to 2 greedy seekers after concealed lands, i.e. in this case, lands that should have passed into the Crown's hands after the abolition of what were now regarded as the superstitious practices they had once supported. Marney also directed that the chapel adjoining the chancel of Lea Marney Church that he had begun should be completed. His executors were to have a tomb of marble set in the wall between chancel and chapel and vaulted over with marble. He directed that his image, made of black marble or touch, i.e. a smooth, fine-grained black stone, should be set on the tomb. So, 2 images of Latin, i.e. brass or a similar metal, depicting his two deceased wives were to lie beside him on the tomb. Thomasine on his right, Elizabeth on his left. His monument is magnificent, and as I was about to cite the sacred text of the Essex volume in Pevsner's Buildings of England. As this volume observes, the composition is in the perpendicular style, but the detail is all early Renaissance. Moreover, it is in terracotta, a material favoured by the Italians at the court. Another elegant monument of the same material and very similar in style is to be seen at Oxborough in Norfolk, the home of Marney's son, Edmund Bedingfield, who played an important part in the funeral ceremonies. So there's almost certainly some connection, and there's in that picture gives me the opportunity of paying tribute to my life's partner and helper on that occasion, our visit to Norfolk, to Oxborough. One of the scenes of my book on love and dishonour in Elizabethan England, two families and a failed marriage. So Lord Marney's monument may have been splendidly innovative, but apart from the fine effigy, it after all isn't quite what he asked for. The side panels and canopy are not of marble, and his wives, I can't see that they were included, I don't know. So the executors obviously allowed themselves some latitude in interpreting his wishes, and this is a theme which I could develop at greater length, but I think it's better to pass straight on and bring the talk to a close at this point. Marney's only remaining son, John, survived him, I'm sad to say, by just under 2 years, dying in April 1525. With him, the dynasty ennobled after his father's long and diligent service came to an end. Marney's magnificent gatehouse, with its blending of late medieval English with Italian Renaissance forms and decoration, nevertheless survives as his spectacular monument. We're very fortunate to be here to see it and admire it today. I hope that this description of his funeral will serve as a reminder of Marney's two interlinked concerns for his soul's health as well as his worldly fame and standing. I'm sure he would welcome prayers for him today. So there we are. You can't actually, sorry, I thought that was a bit clearer, but it says requiescat in Parce, but that's barely visible anyway. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Did the female mourners of the Marney family have any part in the procession or the funeral?
No. No. I mean, their grief was private. Yeah. I mean, women did have a role in women's funerals. I mean, in funerals of their own sex. The female mourners, and obviously men had to carry the beer and stuff like that. But yes, women figured in ladies' processions, but not in men's, at least not in this epoch.
So women would have taken part in Lady Marney's funeral and procession, would they?
I would certainly assume so. I mean, the two previous two. Oh, you mean John's? Yes. Sorry, I'm getting.
More generally of women's participation in the funerals and processions of that time.
Yes, in women's, yes. Not in men's. No, the wife so far as I'm aware, never appeared in her husband's funeral. Of course, the question didn't arise in the case of Lord Marney because both his wives had predeceased him.
Can you tell us a bit more about the use of the colour black and what that signified in the funeral rites? Is it status, or nowadays it's a colour of mourning? But
yes, but it's the colour. It's the colour of mourning. Yes, okay. Yes. I mean, it's very. I mean, it's a way of reminding everybody that they should be mourning, and I think what it does in these all-enveloping hoods and things, I mean, it sort of masks differences in feeling. There may very well have been people there who are genuinely grieving, and others, obviously, who are less affected. I mean, this is, I assume, generally the case. So black it sort of covers everything, but it not only covered people, it covered buildings and the insides of churches. But you're correct, yes, it symbolizes mourning. I don't think there's been a change in that regard, no. And the lights, by contrast, symbolized hope. Hope of salvation, the presence of God in the world, the multiplicity of lights. These are among their chief significances.
Thank you very much for that lecture. It was brilliant. The question I was going to ask you is the importance of the College of Arms, and also
Yes.
the banner. It's what they were used as. In this particular instance, it seems to be used for the sort of funeral procession. Would it also have importance in battle as a place for, as a symbol for people to rally around?
In the Civil War, it was the king's standard, wasn't it? There was the rallying, and the standard bearer was a figure of great symbolic importance. It was Sir Edmund or Ralph Verney who fell at Edgehill, the king's standard bearer. Sir Edmund, I think. But I stand ready to be corrected. I mean, the banneroles, as I think the funeral description suggests, were banners specifically of his descents. Yes.
the journey itself, they must have travelled about 16 miles a day, over 2 days.
Yeah.
You said at some point that when they reached Whitechapel, the 24 poor people's clothes were taken and put on.
Yes.
So does that mean that at that point they went back to London, the journey then continued on horseback?
I'm so glad you've asked that question, because I'm a bit nonplussed myself. I mean, the normal practice would be for the poor men to have the garments in the will. It's clear that from the Norfolk and Northumberland wills, reports and expenses, that was the case. Now, the report doesn't actually say that the poor men processed at Leomani. It doesn't actually give the impression, indeed, that any sort of lengthy formal procession took place. Rather, the impression it conveys, may be misleading, is that the cavalcade that had come from London approached the church, came into the churchyard. And certainly if it had been a big procession, that couldn't have happened. I wonder did the poor men process at Leomani? What happened to them? Did they get their cloaks?
I wondered if those 24 then went back to London, and when they reached Leomani, they employed another 24, which is why they took the gowns with them.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a jolly good question, and the trouble is that the report doesn't answer it.
It's quite interesting in the actual document. there's a real sort of cheeky bit where we're having given you detailed descriptions in London, getting out of London, getting rid of these cloaks, putting them in the cart, and then it goes and they go through many villages, and then they stopped off here, and there's a little bit more, and then they went through many more villages, and half a mile before they got to Marney, they reassemble, and you just think, that was quite whizzy. We've just done sort of 40 miles or something,
yes,
with a lot of, and they went through other villages. So it's quite difficult sometimes to get it all right.
yes.
There's another question here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for bringing the funeral to life so vividly. It's amazing. Thank you. My question is a practical one. Looking at particularly Iceland's beer, what is it made of? Those columns.
Mm.
What would the weight of that be? I mean,
Pretty hefty. Pretty hefty. So if we look at Northumberland's funeral, the account, which I've got here to hand, the main elements of the hearse were timber and wax. So the costs were as follows. For the wax of the hearse, by estimation, £26, 13 shillings and fourpence. That's no doubt a cost originally in marks, which would have been translated into 18th century values by Peck, I think, in his Desiderata Curiosa. Then for the timber and painting of the hearse, £5. So there's an enormous amount of wax in there. But so the total cost of the hearse, which I worked out, would be £31, 13 shillings and fourpence. By no means an inconsiderable sum for those days, but only a small element of the total bill, dwarfed by the black cloth. But yeah, there'd be timber in there.
We'll see you again at 4.
Thank you very much.